All right, hey guys. Can I have the book, Alex? Alex, so this is my brother Alex, as many of you may remember from the video that we did together last month. And he has returned for us to talk about a book that we read together. So we read Empire of the Summer Moon, Quanah Parker and the Rise and Fall of the Comanches, the most powerful Indian tribe in American history, by S.C. Gwynne, which was published, I think, in 2011. Originally, Alex and I were going to read the Journals of Lewis and Clark together because it was a book that we were both super interested in reading. And then we both started it, and I think we got both. I got like 15 pages in. I think Alex may have gone further. But we both just found it very boring and difficult to read. But then Alex sort of got wind of this book from a friend of his and told me about it, and so we decided to read this instead. Because it's a subject.
Friend's grandpa.
His friend's grandpa, okay. It's a subject that we're both very interested in, because we're both interested in Native American history, and the Comanche, a large part of their sort of realm was in Texas, and Alex lives in Texas, so it was interesting in that sense as well. So this book, which has a far too long of a subtitle, I have to say, but this book is about, basically it's a sort of history of the Comanche. The subtitle is a bit deceptive because it makes it sound like it's going to be mainly about Quanah Parker, who was the sort of last great leader of the Comanche in their final days of freedom, in a sense, and also was... after the Comanche had sort of been subjugated and had moved onto a reservation, he was declared as, like, the chief of all the Comanche, which there had never been up to that point. So he was an important person, but the subtitle is a bit deceptive in the extent to which the book is totally about him. It's much more just a history of the Comanche in general and a little bit of history of Texas. But yeah, so it's just the story of how the Comanche were... very slowly subjugated by the United States, which really didn't happen to the late 1800s because it took Americans a very long time to adjust to warfare on the plains, basically. European-style warfare was just not very suited to the open plains where the Comanche were. And so it was just really hard for the United States to actually... conquered the Comanche, basically, because they were fighting on their home turf and because they were perfectly adapted to fighting in this area. Anyway, and then this book tells that history, and then it tells a little bit of history beyond that after the Comanche had moved on to a reservation, and that is the part that's a bit more about Quanah Parker and his leadership of the Comanche and his sort of very vigorous adoption of white American ways of life in certain aspects, not in every aspect, but... Yeah, so that is kind of what the book is about, very vaguely. So, what did you think of it, Alex?
Let's see. So, hello again. It was good. It was really interesting. The first third of the book is definitely the most interesting. And then it gets a little bit boring, and then even more boring. Well, so what I really liked about the first third of the book was that it was a lot more, I guess, detailed, and I really liked the interactions between, like the captives and the Indians, the Comanches. So when, they had, like, from a few of them, I can't remember some of their names. I'm really bad with names.
Cynthia Ann Parker.
No, not her, but other ones that got rescued. They wrote, not biographies, but kind of memoirs. Yeah. And so that was really interesting when he talked about how they were treated in the Comanche camps and stuff like that. But other than that, it was good. It was a good read and really interesting, but it did get a little bit boring towards the middle and the end, I thought.
I think S.C. Gwynne is at his strongest when he's either talking about when he's talking about the Comanche as like a culture or
Yeah.
their history. He's really strong. He's really strong when he's sort of painting portraits of individuals. I think he
Well,
does
that's
a really good.
exactly what the first third of the book. It's more about the individuals, right? He talks about. I think the first chapter is about Mackenzie and about how he's going on this wild hunt, right?
Yeah, and then Mackenzie comes back
And
later
then
in the book, and that's a really
towards
good
the
chapter.
end, and that's good. Yeah.
And Jack Hayes, the
Yep.
guy who kind of made the Texas Rangers.
The county I
name.
live in is Hayes County.
Nice.
Named after him.
Cool.
Yeah.
And Quanah Parker as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was kind of bummed that, and I guess this is just a function of not having any literature on the subject. We really know nothing about Quanah's Indian life, which kind of really bummed me out. Like, all we know is that he was at a few battles, but we don't know if, and he had some wives and kids and everything, but we really, there's no details about his Indian pre-reservation life, which I was kind of bummed about, but it's understandable because it would have had to have come from some captive, or he would have had to have written it, I guess, or some other Indian in the tribe.
Yeah.
But one thing that I definitely didn't like about the book was that he jumped around a lot. Like, within one paragraph, he could be talking about something that happened in the 1840s and then jump ahead to the 70s and then go back to the 40s within like 2 paragraphs.
Yeah.
So it was a little tricky for me to keep track of. I don't know if you...
Yeah, I didn't mind that so much.
No, you're better at keeping track of things like that than I am.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess because I feel like when he does that, it's usually because it's thematically linked somehow.
Yeah, no,
and I like
right.
things that are written sort of on themes rather than strictly chronologically.
I'm chronological, man.
That's fair.
Yeah, I'm all chronological. But the coolest part for me especially was because I've been to pretty much every single one of the places that he talks about in Texas, right? Mm-hmm. There's a cool map in the front of the book. I don't know if y'all can see that. Mm-hmm. But I've been to all of these. I've been to Palo Duro Canyon. I've been up to Amarillo and on the Peace River. I've been all throughout the Red River and San Saba and along the Colorado and Brazos rivers where they talk about these old battles and everything like that. And it's pretty cool. And I don't know what you thought, but when he talks about how hard it is to survive out there, I completely understand it because it's rough out there. We go out there for my field research, for my field work, and we go out to sample these rivers, and we go during the summer a lot, and it's 110 degrees outside, and it's all rock and grass and thorns everywhere, cacti everywhere. Yeah, that was really cool. I could visualize everything that he was talking about when he was describing an area.
Yeah, I think one of the I guess most important parts of the book that I think is important is him sort of there's still a sort of stubborn idea of this romanticized vision of the Old West as like a place of adventure and whatnot, and it was this huge land of opportunity and blah blah blah, and a huge recurring theme that's implicit for a lot of it and explicit at times. That he makes it explicit at times is that actually living on the frontier was incredibly dangerous. Most people living out there were miserable, and most of them, died alone, basically. Whether it was because they were attacked by Comanche, or whether it was because of the weather, the climate, and such, or just sort of being cut off from what we would call civilization. And you can and I think it's easy to see why the Comanche culture kind of developed the way that it did, given where they lived. I mean, because they were such a warlike culture, and it seems to make sense that a culture like that might develop in such an inhospitable area, especially since they weren't by any means the only warlike nation on the plains. I mean, the Sioux and the Cheyenne and Kiowas and Apache and such were all war was a huge part of their culture. Comanche was probably the nation where that was the most the case.
Most ruthless.
Yeah, and another important thing in this book, I think, is that he doesn't really shy away from talking about the atrocities committed on both sort of sides. I think obviously Americans committed horrible atrocities against Native Americans, but the Comanche also did pretty terrible things to people that they attacked, whether they were white or other Native Americans. S.E. Gwynne makes it clear that obviously the Americans were the conquering imperialists, so they were ultimately in the wrong. But again, both sides did do terrible things to people, basically.
The one saving grace, well, for some, was that the Americans generally didn't kill women and children.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, some did. He talks about a few times where that did happen. Yeah. They kill women and children indiscriminately, but the Comanches, they didn't care, man.
Yeah.
They killed a 7-week-old baby.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's like a spoiler, but the way they kill it was brutal.
Yeah.
But you got notes.
Yeah. So like we talked about this the other day. My one big criticism of the book, or not say criticism, but reservation or quibble, I suppose, was some of the sort of language he uses to talk about the Comanche. I wrote down a couple of quotes. He refers to them at one point as low barbarian, pre-civilized, mostly non-agrarian. Mostly non-agrarian, I mean, fair enough, but just language like low barbarian and pre-civilized, I think is just incredibly out of date and problematic, because it's sort of based on a very sort of modern industrialized idea of what constitutes civilization, I guess, and this whole idea that becoming an agrarian society and then becoming an industrial society puts you on the sort of higher plane of existence than people who are perhaps, because Comanche, in terms of their culture, were a bit closer to being hunter-gatherers than to being, they certainly weren't agrarian, they didn't have farming and such, so they were closer to being like humanity's hunter-gatherer ancestors, but thinking that makes them less civilized or something like that, or less complex, I think is really problematic. And I can't like, I guess there's an argument to be made that perhaps S.C. Gwynne was talking about this sort of from the perspective of what the Americans in the 19th century would have viewed them, which would have just been looking at them as sort of savages. But I don't know entirely whether that's the case, just based on the way he talks about it. And so I guess I wish he wouldn't have used that sort of language to talk about them. But at the same time, I'm not going to like call S.C. Gwynne a racist, because I don't think he would have written a whole book about this if he were a racist and thought that Comanche were really like barbarian savages or something, you know what I mean? So that's why it's kind of more of a reservation than exactly a criticism, I suppose. Yeah. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, if you don't. I mean, I think the key point in that was that he was writing from the sense of from the Americans at the time, because relative to Americans at the time, they were pre-civilized. And I think one really good example of this is that, and he talks about this, which I thought was really interesting. He says that the Comanches, or the Native Americans at the time, were like 2,000 years behind the Americans and the European settlers, right? Because they didn't have horses until the Spanish and the Europeans got there, right? So the horses helped out them tremendously, just like the horses helped out Europeans tremendously. So it kind of, I think he talks about the horse as basically the Native Americans' industrial revolution. I think he made that comparison, which I thought was really interesting. So I think that's, you have to read it all in context, right? In the sense that, sure, calling someone pre-civilized now, or barbaric nowadays is bad, not bad, but problematic. But at the time, and from the sense of an 1850s person, American, yes, they were barbaric and pre-civilized. Plus, people back then were I feel like a lot more judgmental.
Yeah, and that's how they would have thought about it without really any scruples. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you have any other points written
down? I didn't have any written down, but okay. Anyway, yeah, and I think he did a really good job of describing the sort of military campaigns in the book, really, in a way that wasn't. Sometimes I find military history can get very tedious because it's like, okay, this army moved here, this army moved here, and then they met here, and this is what happened. And I don't know, it just gets very sort of tedious listening to military maneuvers, and I feel like he sort of avoided that pitfall and made it all very gripping and easy to follow, basically. That might also be the nature of warfare out west, because it was all kind of based on very small groups that were moving around. I mean, there's no army that appears in the narrative of this book that's larger than, like, 2,000, which in a lot of European wars would be unheard of. They had these gigantic pitched armies of hundreds of thousands. So I really enjoyed reading all about that. But
no, and I want to clarify what I said earlier, in the sense that the middle and end of the book are boring relative to the beginning of the book. I recommend it to anybody to read. It's really, really good and really, really interesting, and I really enjoyed it. But when I said it was boring, I mean relative to the first third of the book. Yeah, not like generally boring, but
yeah, and I guess another thing I thought of is and that comes through in the first third more than in the second half, is the fact that there's this narrative surrounding Native American history that the story of Native Americans is just a story of defeat after defeat or something like that, and that they were sort of these sort of weak people who were just sort of stomped upon by this mighty American empire. And really, like, you get a strong sense in a book like this that really wasn't the case.
At least for the Comanches.
And for a lot of others. It's he can't really talk about it here, but for the Comanche especially. It's like the first third of the book is all about how incompetent Americans were at fighting the Comanche, basically.
Yeah.
They had guns, which ostensibly were an advantage, but when you're fighting people who can shoot whatever it was, 100 arrows per whatever, or 10 arrows per minute or something like that, then a gun where you can shoot one bullet per like 5 minutes is...
I think it's 2 bullets per minute.
Okay, well, there you go. And so that was very interesting as well. So
yeah, and I think one thing too, I think a big theme throughout the struggle with conquering Texas and the Comanches was cockiness. Because I think a prime example of that was it Hayes who figured out how to beat the Comanches?
Yeah.
Out of San Antonio, but that was like in the 40s or something, I think. I'd have to look back at the exact date. But he kicked the crap out of a lot of Comanches. Yeah. And then he died, and nobody bothered to look at his tactics.
Yeah.
Until Mackenzie. I don't even remember if he studied Hayes at all, or he just was smart and figured it out like Hayes figured it out.
Yeah.
So that's a 30 or 40 year gap where the Comanches were doing a lot of winning, right? Yep. And then Hayes and Mackenzie were the two big ones that won a lot. Mm-hmm. Mackenzie obviously was the final one that won everything. But I think cockiness has a lot to do with it because, when Hayes was gone, the Civil War obviously didn't help either.
Yeah,
he talked about that for a while how that Civil War opened up the Comanches.
Yeah, but
I think if people paid more attention to, and this is a theme for everything, people pay closer attention to history. It has a tendency to repeat itself.
Yeah, yeah.
So I thought that was kind of interesting, and I wasn't terribly surprised.
Yeah,
but no, it was good, and I really, as messed up as it is, my favorite chapter was when he talks about the Parker Fort and Cynthia Ann Parker and her relatives being captured. Yeah, that was brutal, but that was the most interesting. I think that was like chapter 2 or 3. That was a really interesting chapter. And one thing I want to know more about is why some people were treated as nicely and then some people were not, and they were just like tortured and killed, you know, because they did it to everyone. They tortured and killed men and women, and then they integrated men and women. Not necessarily, because he talks about old white dudes that were full Comanches. And I guess they could have been kids when they were captured, but I don't really know.
Yeah.
I can't, but I thought that was kind of...
It could just depend on who, you know, because, I mean, obviously, every Comanche person will be different. I mean, just like every individual is different, so different Comanches are led by different chiefs, you know, different bands. He talks about how decentralized the Comanche are.
Yeah,
so different bands of the Comanche.
They don't even have like a proper chief.
Yeah, and so different bands of the Comanche, I'm sure, did things differently, and just different people had different ideas about what to do.
But I agree with Lukács too, not to change the subject, but I think Empire of the Summer Moon, Rise and Fall of the Comanches, the most powerful tribe in North American history, would be a proper title for this. I think you can get rid of Quanah Parker. Or put him last.
Yeah.
At the end, and then not have his picture. Because when I got this, I was like, oh, this is going to be all about Quanah Parker.
Yeah.
And then he's featured in 1 or 2 chapters in the middle, and then the last 2 or 3 chapters are about him and his reservation life. So, and it's really not about Quanah Parker at all. Actually, I think his mother's more of a central focus than he is.
Yeah. And honestly, I also, like, there is a point where this title, Empire of the Summer Moon, does make sense, where I think he mentions something about Empire of the Summer Moon in his narration, but I feel like Empire of the Comanche Moon would make more sense, because it's like a Comanche moon.
Comanche moon is full moon, though.
Yeah.
Not summer moon.
I know, but, like, he talks about Comanche moons much more than he talks about...
Yeah, I don't know where this title comes from.
Yeah.
I don't remember. The only thing I remember, and this could just be, you know, I read before I go to bed, but so I might not remember, but the only thing in the entire book that I remember being about moons was talking about full moons, being Texans called a full moon, a Comanche moon was because that's when Comanches would attack.
Yeah.
Because it was bright enough outside. But I don't recall anything about summer moon.
Which is why Empire of the Comanche Moon would make a bit more sense, because he actually mentions Comanche moons a few times.
It would, and, you know, maybe, like I said, I could have just missed it, and maybe we could try to, you know, just do a quick Google search on that. But one thing I really thought, too, is that he lists all his sources. He has a very extensive bibliography for each chapter.
It would be interesting if some of those memoirs you were talking about, it would be interesting to read those, read the primary sources. I kind of would be pessimistic about whether or not any of them are, like, in print in decent editions, you know?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you can get copies of them somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure somewhere online there's some really old copies of, or, like, probably academic libraries.
Yeah. Yep.
Maybe that are in Texas would have them.
Probably. But,
yeah.
No, it was a good book. I recommend it to anybody. I know, you know, me and all my Texas friends... Well, I just finished it like a few days ago, so now we're all going to talk about it and everything, and they all love it because they're all from Texas, and, you know, obviously the Comanches are a big deal in Texas, but some of these old photos were cool too.
The photo of Cynthia Ann Parker, really, I don't know if they're going to make that out well, but
you can just Google it, and I'm sure it'll pop right up.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's cool.
All right.
It's a good book. I recommend it.
Yeah, so anyway,
I don't know.
That's Empire of the Summer Moon. Anyone out there has read it and has thoughts, please give us them. I know one of my fellow booktubers said that he also had one major criticism of the book, so I'm interested. Brian over at Bookish, tell me what your criticism is. But anyway, we will sign off, and thanks for watching, guys, and bye.
Have a good New Year.
Yeah.